Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Tennessee. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In September of 1867, the Mountain Eagle newspaper of Cades Cove, Tennessee, published a brief notice that would mark the beginning of one of the most perplexing disappearances in Appalachian history. The article reported that Silas and Josiah Blackwood, prominent landowners and respected members of the community, had failed to return from an expedition to explore Whispering Cave in the Great Smoky Mountains. The brothers, aged 42 and 39 respectively, had departed their estate on September 18th with provisions for a week's journey and a local guide named Thomas Caldwell. The newspaper noted their considerable land holdings throughout the valley, their reputation as educated men of means, and their recent acquisition of the property containing the cave system they had set out to explore. What the brief article failed to capture was the brothers' growing obsession with Cherokee legends surrounding the cave and their extensive collection of writings on ancient rituals and unexplained phenomena. The settlement of Cades Cove in 1867 was remote, even by the standards of post-Civil War Tennessee, a collection of scattered homesteads connected by rough mountain paths where families lived in relative isolation and news traveled slowly. The Blackwood estate stood apart from the modest cabins of other settlers, a substantial two-story manor house constructed of quarried limestone that seemed to watch over the valley like a sentinel. Neighbors would later recall that the brothers had shown particular interest in acquiring parcels of land that local Cherokee considered sacred, offering prices that none could refuse despite warnings about disturbing places better left alone. As autumn settled over the mountains and the brothers' return date passed without word, what began as concern among business associates would evolve into one of the most disturbing mysteries in the region's history, one that would draw investigators, scholars, and eventually lead to the permanent sealing of Whispering Cave itself. The Blackwood brothers had arrived in Cades Cove in 1858, bringing with them considerable wealth from their family's Virginia tobacco plantations and a reputation for eccentricity that would only grow during their years in Tennessee. Silas, the elder, had studied at Yale and spent several years traveling through Europe, studying archaeology and ancient languages, while Josiah had devoted himself to the natural sciences, particularly geology and mineralogy. Their decision to relocate to the remote Tennessee mountains puzzled their social circles in Richmond, but the brothers seemed driven by intellectual pursuits rather than commerce. They methodically acquired lands throughout the valley, showing particular interest in properties containing caves, unusual rock formations, or sites mentioned in Cherokee oral traditions. Their manor house, constructed over 2 years using imported materials and skilled craftsmen from Knoxville, contained a library that rivaled those found in major cities, with volumes covering subjects ranging from Sanskrit texts to contemporary scientific journals on acoustics and magnetism. Martha Hensley, their housekeeper who had served the brothers since their arrival, would later describe rooms filled with maps annotated in multiple languages, collections of minerals and artifacts, and strange instruments whose purposes she could not fathom. The brothers maintained correspondence with scholars throughout America and Europe, ordering books and equipment that arrived in carefully packed crates marked with symbols she did not recognize. While they participated minimally in local social affairs, maintaining cordial but distant relationships with their neighbors, they showed intense interest in speaking with the eldest members of the Cherokee community, taking detailed notes during conversations about traditional stories and beliefs. Their reputation as learned but peculiar men grew when they began hiring local men to guide them to remote caves and ancient sites, paying generously but requiring absolute discretion about their destinations and discoveries. The brothers often disappeared for days at a time on these expeditions, returning with soil samples, rock specimens, and detailed sketches of underground formations that they would study late into the night. They constructed a special storage facility on their property, climate-controlled and secured with multiple locks, where they housed their growing collection of archaeological finds and geological specimens. Local workers who helped build this facility reported that some of the stored items seemed to emit faint sounds or showed unusual luminescent properties in darkness. By 1867, The brothers had amassed not only substantial land holdings, but also a collection of knowledge about the region's hidden places that exceeded even that of the Cherokee elders who had inhabited these mountains for generations. Their obsessive documentation included cross-referenced notes, connecting local sites to similar locations they had studied in Europe, suggesting patterns and relationships that spanned continents. The Cherokee people of the region had long spoken of the cave the Blackwood brothers intended to explore, though they knew it by another name entirely. Asgaya Gigaje, which translated roughly to the mouth that swallows light. According to Samuel Crowfeather, a respected Cherokee elder who had reluctantly shared his knowledge with the brothers in exchange for ensuring his family could remain on their ancestral land, the cave had been forbidden territory for as long as the stories had been told. The entrance itself was marked with ancient pictographs that predated even the Cherokee presence in the region, crude figures that seemed to show humans entering a dark mouth in the earth, but, significantly, none emerging. Crowfeather had warned the brothers that the cave was not merely a physical space, but something that existed partially outside normal understanding, a place where the boundary between the world of the living and other realms grew thin. He spoke of warriors who had entered seeking glory or treasure but never returned, and of those few who had emerged changed in fundamental ways, aging rapidly, or speaking of impossible spaces that extended far beyond what the mountain could contain. The stories passed down through generations described men who claimed to have walked for months through passages that led to underground seas, lit by no sun, cities carved from living rock, inhabited by beings that were not quite human, and chambers where time flowed differently, allowing glimpses of past and future events simultaneously. The brothers had listened with what appeared to be scholarly interest, taking detailed notes and asking probing questions about specific acoustic phenomena mentioned in the stories, particularly accounts of voices that seemed to come from the rock itself, and sounds that could drive men mad. Most disturbing to Crowfeather were their questions about ritual preparations used by ancient peoples before entering sacred caves, especially their interest in the use of reflected light and specific tonal frequencies that were said to open ways that should remain closed. The elder tried to convey that these were not mere superstitions but warnings, based on generations of tragic experience, describing how entire Cherokee hunting parties had vanished after ignoring the taboos, and how the few survivors who emerged spoke of passages that led not deeper into the earth but sideways into spaces that should not exist. He emphasized that the cave's danger lay not in physical hazards like drops or flooding, but in its fundamental wrongness, its existence as a wound in reality that conscious beings were not meant to explore. Despite his clear warnings that the cave was cursed, and that no good could come from disturbing it, the brothers seemed only more determined to explore it, viewing the Cherokee prohibitions as evidence of phenomena worth investigating rather than dangers to be avoided. Their dismissive attitude toward these warnings would prove to be a fatal miscalculation, though the full consequences would not become apparent until long after they had vanished into the breathing darkness of Whispering Cave. In the weeks leading up to their final expedition, Martha Hensley observed increasingly peculiar behavior from the Blackwood brothers that went far beyond their usual eccentricity. She would later testify that they had begun working through the night in their study, emerging only for hurried meals with dark circles under their eyes and enfevered intensity in their manner. They ordered unusual supplies from Nashville and beyond, including hundreds of feet of rope, specialized mining equipment, various chemical compounds whose names she could not pronounce, and, most bizarrely, dozens of mirrors ranging from small hand-held pieces to large panels that required special crating. The brothers constructed what they called an experimental chamber in a previously unused room of the manor, sealing it with heavy curtains and installing multiple locks while forbidding any staff from entering. From behind the door came strange sounds at all hours, including pure tones that seemed to make the walls vibrate, complex rhythmic patterns that induced headaches in anyone who listened too long, and occasionally, voices that didn't sound quite like either brother, speaking in languages she didn't recognize. They began taking precise measurements of shadows at different times of day, creating charts that tracked the relationship between celestial positions and magnetic variations they claimed to detect in certain locations on their property. Silas developed an obsession with tuning forks and resonance, filling notebooks with calculations about frequencies and harmonics, while Josiah focused on the refractive properties of various crystals and solutions. Martha noticed they had begun eating less, seeming sustained by their work alone, and when they did take meals, they would often pause mid-conversation to jot down sudden inspirations or rush back to their experimental chamber to test new theories. The brothers installed specialized equipment throughout the house, including devices that produced sustained tones at specific frequencies and mirrors positioned to create complex patterns of reflected light. Most disturbing to Martha were the changes in their physical appearance and behavior as their experiments intensified. Both men began experiencing periods of disorientation, where they would stare at empty spaces, as if seeing something invisible to others, and they complained of hearing sounds that no one else could perceive. Their skin took on an unhealthy pallor despite spending time outdoors, and their eyes developed an unsettling quality, seeming to focus on distances beyond the walls of whatever room they occupied. They spoke of their coming expedition with religious fervor, describing it not as exploration but as a culmination of all their years of study. Their final preparations included having special clothing made with numerous pockets for instruments and samples, and they spent hours studying Cherokee astronomical knowledge, particularly regarding periods when they believed the cave would be most receptive. The night before their departure, Martha heard them conducting some kind of ritual in the sealed chamber, with droning sounds and flashing lights visible beneath the door that continued until dawn, accompanied by what sounded like mathematical recitations spoken in unison. On the morning of September 18th, 1867, Silas and Josiah Blackwood departed their estate in the company of Thomas Caldwell, an experienced woodsman and cave explorer who had guided them on previous expeditions into lesser caverns throughout the region. Caldwell, a man of 34 years with a reputation for steadiness and reliability, had initially been reluctant to guide them to Whispering Cave, having heard the Cherokee warnings and experienced his own unsettling encounters near its entrance during hunting trips. However, the brothers offered him a sum equivalent to a year's wages and assured him they would take all necessary precautions, showing him their extensive equipment and preparations. The party set out at dawn, with 3 pack mules carrying supplies including food for a week, camping equipment, ropes and climbing gear, surveying instruments, the mysterious mirrors carefully wrapped in canvas, and several sealed containers whose contents Caldwell was instructed not to disturb. The journey to Whispering Cave took most of the day, following old Cherokee trails that wound through dense forest and up steep mountainsides where the trees grew gnarled and strange, their branches forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate. As they climbed higher, Caldwell noticed that the wildlife became increasingly scarce, with no bird songs or small animal movements disturbing the forest floor, creating an atmosphere of watchful waiting. The brothers seemed energized by the growing silence, frequently consulting their compasses and taking readings with instruments Caldwell didn't recognize, making notes about variations they claimed to detect in the Earth's magnetic field. They stopped several times at seemingly unremarkable locations where the brothers would produce tuning forks and strike them, listening intently to the reverberations and nodding to each other with satisfaction when certain tones produced what they called sympathetic responses from the surrounding rocks. As they approached the cave entrance in the late afternoon, Caldwell noted that the usual forest sounds had ceased entirely, creating an oppressive silence broken only by their footsteps and labored breathing. The entrance itself was larger than he remembered, a jagged mouth in the limestone cliff face, surrounded by the weathered Cherokee pictographs that seemed to writhe in the shifting shadows. The air near the entrance felt different, thicker somehow, and Caldwell experienced a sensation of pressure in his ears, similar to a rapid change in altitude. The brothers showed no hesitation, immediately beginning to unpack their equipment and set up a base camp just inside the entrance, where shafts of dying sunlight still penetrated. They spent the remaining daylight hours taking measurements with various instruments, making notes about temperature variations and magnetic readings that Caldwell didn't understand, and most unnervingly, conducting acoustic experiments that produced echoes that seemed to come from impossible directions. As darkness fell and they prepared for their first descent into the cave proper, Caldwell would later report that both brothers seemed to be in the grip of an almost religious fervor, speaking rapidly to each other about calculations and preparations, while their eyes held a feverish gleam that made him deeply uneasy about what they might find in the depths below. Thomas Caldwell's account of what transpired within Whispering Cave, given to Sheriff William Durant in a series of increasingly fragmented interviews before his untimely death, remains the only first-hand testimony of the Blackwood brothers' final expedition. According to Caldwell, the first day's exploration proceeded relatively normally as they descended through passages he had partially explored on previous occasions, though he noted the brothers showed unusual interest in formations most cavers would ignore, spending hours examining particular configurations of stalactites and measuring distances between seemingly random points. They moved deliberately through the cave system, with the brothers frequently stopping to take acoustic readings, striking tuning forks, and listening to the reverberations with intense concentration, making notes when certain frequencies produced what they described as anomalous responses. The brothers had brought detailed maps that appeared to be compilations of Cherokee oral descriptions and their own theoretical calculations, which proved unnervingly accurate in predicting the layout of passages Caldwell had never seen mapped before. On the second day, they entered passages Caldwell had never seen before, following a route the brothers seemed to know despite claiming no previous visits to this cave, navigating by consulting notebooks filled with diagrams that appeared to be based on Cherokee descriptions and their own mysterious calculations. The passages began to exhibit properties that defied conventional understanding, with corridors that seemed to extend further than the mountain could contain, chambers where dropped objects fell in directions other than down, and most disturbing, sections where the cave walls appeared to pulse rhythmically, as if the mountain itself was breathing. The brothers documented these anomalies with scientific precision, taking measurements and making sketches, showing particular excitement when their instruments detected what they called dimensional irregularities at certain points. They began setting up mirrors at specific locations, creating patterns of reflected light that seemed to reveal passages and spaces that weren't visible without the reflections, openings that appeared solid to direct observation, but showed depths in the mirror's surfaces. The temperature in these deeper passages fluctuated wildly, sometimes dropping to near freezing between one step and the next, while their instruments showed magnetic fields that shifted and swirled like living things. Caldwell reported feeling increasingly disoriented, experiencing vertigo even on level ground and finding it difficult to maintain his sense of direction despite his years of cave experience. The brothers showed no fear at these anomalies, but rather excitement, taking constant measurements and making notes while urging Caldwell to help them proceed deeper. On the third day, they discovered what they termed the cathedral, a vast chamber so large their lanterns could not illuminate the far walls or ceiling. Where acoustic properties created effects Caldwell struggled to describe, sounds seemed to originate from within solid rock. Their own voices returned as echoes speaking words they had not said, and beneath it all, a deep thrumming that the brothers claimed matched certain frequencies they had studied. The search party assembled to find the Blackwood brothers represented one of the largest rescue efforts in the region's history, comprising local law enforcement, experienced cavers from surrounding counties, and even a few Cherokee guides who overcame their cultural taboos out of respect for Sheriff Durant's request. The team of 12 men entered Whispering Cave on September 23rd, 5 days after the brothers' expedition had begun, equipped with ample supplies and following Caldwell's directions as best they could, though he remained at the surface, refusing to return to the depths, despite offers of substantial payment. The searchers had prepared thoroughly, bringing extra lanterns, medical supplies, and even weapons, though what they might need weapons against in a cave remained unspoken. What they discovered during their 3-day search defied conventional explanation and left several members of the party with psychological scars that would persist throughout their lives. The cave seemed to actively resist their search efforts, with passages that had been described in Caldwell's account appearing to have changed configuration, forcing them to constantly revise their mental maps and retrace their steps. At various depths within the cave system, they found pieces of the Blackwood brothers' equipment arranged with deliberate precision, ropes coiled in perfect spirals, instruments placed at specific intervals as if marking a trail, and pages from notebooks weighted down with stones containing calculations and diagrams that hurt to examine closely. Several searchers reported experiencing severe headaches when attempting to decipher the mathematical formulas, with one man claiming the symbols seemed to move and rearrange themselves when viewed directly. The search party reported that the cave itself seemed to resist their presence, with passages that had been wide during descent becoming barely navigable during attempted returns, compass needles spinning without pattern, and temperatures fluctuating wildly between chambers. They discovered evidence that the brothers had been conducting extensive experiments throughout the cave system, finding mirror arrangements at multiple locations, areas where the cave walls had been marked with symbols matching those in the brothers' notes, and strange crystalline formations that appeared to have been cultivated or modified rather than naturally occurring. Most disturbing were the footprints they discovered in chambers far deeper than should have been accessible, fresh tracks in cave clay that seemed to lead into solid walls or passages too narrow for a human body to enter, yet bearing the distinctive marks of the brothers' specially crafted boots. In what they believed to be the cathedral, based on Caldwell's description, they found the mirror array still in place, creating reflections that showed spaces and angles that didn't correspond to the chamber's actual geometry, and several searchers reported seeing movement in the mirrors that didn't match their own. The acoustic phenomena Caldwell had described were even more pronounced, with voices clearly audible from within the rock, speaking in languages none recognized, and at times what might have been the Blackwood brothers calling out from impossible distances below. After 3 days of increasingly disturbing discoveries and the near loss of 2 searchers who became separated in passages that seemed to reconfigure themselves, Sheriff Durant made the difficult decision to abandon the search, declaring the brothers lost and the cave too dangerous for further exploration. Following the failed rescue attempt, Martha Hensley made a shocking discovery while preparing the Blackwood estate for eventual sale. As the brothers had no known heirs and authorities presumed them dead. In the sealed experimental chamber, hidden within a false bottom drawer of an ornate desk, she found a leather-bound journal that the brothers had apparently maintained throughout their years of research. The journal, which she immediately turned over to Sheriff Durant, revealed the true nature of their obsession with Whispering Cave and cast their disappearance in an even more disturbing light. Written in both brothers' hands with entries dating back to their arrival in Tennessee, the journal documented their growing belief that certain caves were not merely geological formations, but interfaces between our world and what they termed the spaces between, dimensions or realities that existed parallel to but separate from normal human experience. The entries began with scholarly observations about unusual acoustic and magnetic properties found in certain cave systems worldwide, but gradually evolved into increasingly esoteric theories about the nature of reality itself. They had traced legends from around the world describing similar sites, always marked by acoustic anomalies, unusual magnetic properties, and consistent reports of passages that defied physical laws. Their research had taken them to libraries in London, Paris, and Vienna, where they had studied ancient texts describing sacred caves that served as gateways to other worlds, compiling similarities between Celtic, Norse, Hindu, and Native American traditions that suggested a shared understanding of these phenomena. The Cherokee stories of Whispering Cave had drawn them specifically because of references to warriors who had entered the cave and returned, claiming to have spent years in strange lands while only days had passed outside, or those who had glimpsed cities of impossible architecture through openings that appeared and vanished like mirages. The brothers had developed complex theories involving harmonic frequencies and reflected light as keys to navigating these interfaces, believing that ancient peoples had understood these principles and encoded them in their sacred sites. The journal contained detailed calculations correlating lunar and stellar positions with magnetic variations they had measured at various cave entrances, along with musical notations they believed represented the frequencies of passage. They described experiments conducted in their sealed chamber, where they claimed to have achieved partial success in creating small, dimensional apertures, reporting glimpses of landscapes that matched no known earthly terrain, and detecting traces of atmospheric compositions that shouldn't exist. Most disturbing were the final entries, written in an increasingly frantic hand, describing their certainty that they were being called by intelligences existing within these spaces between, entities they believed had been waiting for someone with the knowledge to properly open the way. The brothers wrote of dreams filled with mathematical equations that solved problems they hadn't known existed, of hearing voices in frequencies just beyond human perception offering guidance, and of a growing compulsion to complete their work and enter the cave during the September alignment. The last coherent entry, dated September 17th, simply stated, "Tomorrow we answer." The calculations are complete. The cave will breathe us in, and we will walk between the spaces where they have always dwelt. We go not as explorers, but as invited guests to realms that exist beneath and beyond. May God forgive us for what we are about to unleash. In the months following the Blackwood brothers' disappearance, their abandoned manor became a source of increasing unease for the residents of Cades Cove, as reports of strange occurrences began to accumulate with disturbing regularity. Neighbors passing the estate at night reported seeing lights moving through the windows of the upper floors, particularly in the sealed experimental chamber, despite the house being locked and empty. Calvin Pritchard, whose farm bordered the Blackwood property, swore he had seen two figures silhouetted against the illuminated windows engaged in animated conversation, though when Sheriff Durant investigated, he found the house dark and undisturbed, with a thick layer of dust on the floors, showing no footprints. These sightings became so frequent that locals began avoiding the road past the manor after dark, taking longer routes to reach their destinations rather than risk encountering whatever haunted the abandoned estate. More unsettling were the sounds that carried across the valley on still nights, complex harmonic tones similar to those Martha Hensley had described emanating from the experimental chamber, accompanied by what listeners described as voices engaged in scholarly debate, using technical terms and languages they couldn't identify. The sounds seemed to follow a pattern, growing more intense during certain phases of the moon, and reaching crescendos that could be heard miles away, causing dogs to howl and horses to break free from their stalls in terror. Martha herself, who had been retained to maintain the property while legal matters were resolved, refused to enter the house alone, after finding equipment in the experimental chamber rearranged in patterns matching diagrams from the brothers' journal, items she was certain had been packed away in crates. She reported finding fresh chalk marks on the floors, forming geometric patterns, candles that had been lit and extinguished despite no one having access to the rooms, and most unnervingly, journal pages filled with new entries in the brothers' handwriting, discussing observations and experiments conducted after their disappearance. The phenomena intensified during certain lunar phases that corresponded with notations in the brothers' calculations, with multiple witnesses reporting not just lights and sounds but glimpses of the brothers themselves, walking the grounds, always moving toward the path that led to Whispering Cave, visible only briefly before vanishing like smoke. Local livestock began avoiding the side of pastures nearest the estate, and several horses had to be destroyed after injuring themselves trying to flee when passing the property. Farmers reported that crops planted in fields adjacent to the Blackwood land grew strangely, producing fruit and vegetables that looked normal but tasted of minerals and earth, as if the very soil had been fundamentally altered by proximity to whatever energies emanated from the estate. A formal investigation in December 1867 found physical evidence of the reported phenomena, including unusual wear patterns on the floors, suggesting regular movement, containers of chemicals that had been recently opened despite the house being sealed, and most inexplicably, fresh notebook entries in the brothers' handwriting discussing observations and calculations dated weeks after their disappearance. These findings led to the house being permanently sealed by county authorities, though the phenomena continued, leading many to believe that whatever the brothers had discovered in Whispering Cave, they had somehow found a way to return to their estate while remaining lost to the normal world. The mysterious death of Thomas Caldwell, 2 weeks after the failed rescue mission, added another disturbing chapter to the Blackwood case and eliminated the only witness to what had actually transpired in the depths of Whispering Cave. Caldwell had been staying with his sister in Knoxville, having refused to return to his home near Cades Cove, claiming he could still hear sounds from the cave carried on the wind. His sister Mary reported that he had barely slept since his return, spending his nights writing frantically in a journal and covering every surface in his room with strange diagrams and repeated phrases. She described how her once robust brother had deteriorated rapidly, losing weight despite eating regularly, and developing a persistent tremor in his hands that made his formerly precise handwriting nearly illegible. His behavior became increasingly erratic as he insisted on keeping all windows and doors sealed, claiming that the spaces between could seep through any opening, and he would spend hours listening to walls and floors as if expecting to hear something approaching. On the morning of October 8th, she found him dead in his locked room, the windows sealed with rags and towels, his body showing all the signs of severe dehydration, despite a full pitcher of water sitting untouched beside his bed. The walls of the room were covered in writings, some in English but many in symbols that resembled those found in the Blackwood journal, all repetitions of phrases like, "They're still walking downward," "The cave breathes with them inside it," and "The passages never end, they branch and branch forever." The diagrams showed impossible geometries, passages that folded back on themselves, and chambers existing in the same space simultaneously, accompanied by calculations that seemed to describe spatial relationships that couldn't exist in three-dimensional reality. Most disturbing was a detailed map drawn on one wall, showing the cave system extending far beyond any known surveys, with notations indicating depths that would place chambers miles below the Earth's surface and passages connecting to locations hundreds of miles away. The county coroner, Dr. Benjamin Shaw, conducted a thorough examination and made a startling discovery that he initially hesitated to include in his official report. Caldwell's inner ear structures showed profound alterations, with the cochlea exhibiting crystalline formations unlike anything in medical literature, changes that Dr. Shaw theorized might have resulted from exposure to sustained frequencies beyond the range of human hearing. The doctor also noted that Caldwell's pupils remained dilated even in death and showed an unusual reflective quality, as if they had been fundamentally altered by something they had witnessed. Further examination revealed that Caldwell's brain tissue showed signs of unusual electrical activity patterns preserved in the neural pathways, suggesting exposure to electromagnetic fields of unprecedented intensity. Among Caldwell's effects were found several items he had apparently taken from the cave without informing the authorities, including fragments of mineral formations that exhibited properties no geologist could explain, appearing to shift between solid and liquid states depending on the angle of observation, and a small mirror from the brothers' array that showed reflections of spaces that didn't exist in the room where it was held. These items were eventually sealed in the county courthouse vault after several people who handled them reported experiencing disorientation, vivid dreams of endless cave passages, and hearing faint echoes of voices calling from impossible distances. Investigation into historical records revealed that the Blackwood brothers' tragic expedition was far from the first disappearance associated with Whispering Cave, but rather the latest in a pattern stretching back through decades of documented incidents and centuries of oral tradition. Cherokee records spoke of the cave as one of several hollow places where the normal world grew thin, requiring specific rituals and protections for safe passage that had been largely forgotten even by the 1800s. The earliest written account dated to 1794, when a surveying party mapping the region for the new American government lost 3 members who entered the cave to seek shelter from a storm and were never seen again despite extensive searches. In 1823, a group of hunters reported finding relatively fresh human remains in the cave, wearing clothing from different eras, as if victims from various time periods had been collected in a single chamber. The most significant prior incident occurred in 1842, when a well-equipped scientific expedition from the University of Virginia entered the cave to study its unusual properties. Of the 5 men who entered, only 1 emerged after being missing for 3 weeks, though he claimed to have been underground for merely 3 days. Samuel Morrison, the sole survivor, was found in a state of severe physical deterioration, having aged dramatically during his time in the cave, his hair turned white, and his body bearing the wear of many years despite his brief absence. Morrison's account, recorded by physicians before his death days later, spoke of passages that led to vast underground spaces filled with structures that defied description, of encountering other lost explorers from different eras who seemed trapped in endless wanderings, and of a constant sound he described as the breathing dark that grew louder the deeper one traveled. He claimed that time moved differently in different parts of the cave, that he had witnessed his companions age to dust in moments or become frozen like statues while he remained aware, and that the cave itself was not truly a cave, but something wearing the shape of one, a predator that fed on human curiosity and drew in those who sought to understand it. These historical precedents, unknown to the Blackwood brothers during their research, established a clear pattern of the cave, claiming those who ventured too deep while occasionally releasing survivors whose accounts were too fantastic to be believed. In 1869, 2 years after the Blackwood disappearance, the Smithsonian Institution funded a scientific expedition to Whispering Cave, led by Dr. Marcus Turner, a respected geologist who had made significant contributions to the understanding of limestone cave systems throughout the Americas. Turner assembled a team of 5 specialists, including a photographer, a surveyor, an acoustic engineer, and 2 experienced cavers, equipped with the latest scientific instruments and determined to apply rigorous methodology to understanding the reported anomalies. The expedition's findings, documented in Turner's journal and official reports that were subsequently sealed in the Smithsonian archives, provided the most detailed account of the cave's genuinely anomalous properties, while raising more questions than they answered. Using precise measurements and multiple instruments to verify their observations, the team documented temperature variations between adjacent chambers that violated thermodynamic principles, with differences of up to 40 degrees Fahrenheit across spaces separated by mere inches of rock. The surveyor's attempts to map the cave revealed passages that seemed to occupy the same 3-dimensional space without intersecting, creating what he described as impossible geometries that pain the mind to contemplate. Most significant were the acoustic properties documented by the sound engineer, who recorded frequencies that originated from within solid rock with no apparent source, complex harmonic patterns that repeated with mathematical precision, and what appeared to be voices speaking in unknown languages that emerged from the interference patterns of these frequencies. In the chamber Caldwell had called the Cathedral, Turner's team made their most disturbing discovery, finding the Blackwood brothers' final camp perfectly preserved as if they had just stepped away moments before. The mirror array remained in place, creating visual effects the photographer was unable to capture, as the images showed spaces and entities not visible to the naked eye. Personal effects, including the brothers' notebooks, were recovered, containing entries dated after their disappearance, describing their journey downward through the breathing passages and their encounters with those who dwell in the between spaces. The expedition was cut short when 2 team members began experiencing symptoms similar to those that had affected Caldwell, reporting auditory hallucinations and showing signs of the same inner ear changes, leading Turner to order an immediate withdrawal from the cave, despite having explored only a fraction of the documented passages. Dr. Turner's most revolutionary contribution to understanding Whispering Cave came through his pioneering use of early acoustic recording devices, making him one of the first scientists to attempt to document anomalous sounds using mechanical means. Using a large phonograph specially modified for field recording, Turner captured over 20 wax cylinders of audio from various locations within the cave, creating an archive of sounds that would prove both invaluable and deeply disturbing to future researchers. The recordings, when played back at the surface, revealed layers of acoustic phenomena that hadn't been consciously perceived by the team during recording, including subsonic frequencies that induced physical symptoms in listeners, voices speaking coherently in languages that linguists couldn't identify but that showed consistent grammatical structures, and most remarkably, what appeared to be responses to questions the team had asked aloud while exploring. One particularly unsettling recording from the Cathedral captured what sounded like the Blackwood brothers themselves, their voices emerging from the ambient cave sounds to discuss their ongoing explorations in present tense, despite having been missing for 2 years. They spoke of descending through the vertical maze, of chambers that existed between heartbeats, and of learning to navigate by sound rather than sight in spaces where light behaved according to different laws. The physical effects of these recordings on listeners were documented by Turner and included temporal disorientation, with some subjects losing hours while listening to minutes of playback, others experiencing vivid hallucinations of vast underground spaces, and several developing permanent changes to their hearing that allowed them to perceive frequencies normally outside human range. The recordings also appeared to change over time, with subsequent playbacks revealing new voices and sounds not present in earlier sessions, as if the cylinders continued to record even while stored in silence. Turner's attempts to analyze the mathematical properties of the frequencies revealed patterns that corresponded to the calculations in the Blackwood journal, suggesting the brothers had discovered or been taught specific acoustic keys to navigating the cave's anomalous spaces. The Smithsonian ultimately restricted access to these recordings after 3 researchers studying them suffered psychological breakdowns, with one claiming he could hear the cave calling to him from thousands of miles away. By 1871, the accumulation of tragedies, disappearances, and inexplicable phenomena associated with Whispering Cave had created sufficient public pressure that local authorities, supported by the state government, made the decision to permanently seal the cave entrance using explosives. The operation, led by a military engineer named Colonel James Whitmore, who had experience with demolition during the Civil War, should have been a straightforward matter of calculating charge placements to collapse the limestone entrance, but the cave seemed to resist their efforts with an almost sentient determination. Workers reported that tools would malfunction at crucial moments, with drill bits shattering against rock that showed no unusual hardness, fuses extinguishing themselves despite being properly waterproofed, and several instances of carefully placed charges simply vanishing overnight, with no trace of theft or disturbance. Even more unsettling were the sounds that emerged from the cave during the sealing attempts, not merely the expected echoes of their work, but what multiple workers described as knocking from within the rock itself, rhythmic patterns that seemed to respond to their activities with increasing urgency. On several occasions, workers fled the site, claiming to have seen figures moving in the darkness beyond their lights, humanoid shapes that appeared to be ascending from impossible depth. The final attempt to detonate the charges on November 15th succeeded only partially, with the explosion producing results that Colonel Whitmore's report described as architecturally impossible, creating a collapse that sealed the entrance while somehow leaving a small opening at the top that seemed to breathe with regular rhythm. Efforts to seal this opening proved futile, as materials placed over it were found scattered each morning, leading to the decision to install heavy iron gates secured with the strongest locks available. The gates were inscribed with warnings in English and Cherokee, though workers reported that additional symbols appeared on the metal overnight, all characters that hurt to look at directly and that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. The official report declared the cave successfully sealed, but those who had participated in the operation knew the truth, that they had merely placed a barrier over something that fundamentally could not be contained by physical means. Despite the official sealing of Whispering Cave, reports of anomalous activity in the surrounding area continued throughout the 1,870 seconds and 1,880 seconds, suggesting that whatever properties the cave possessed extended beyond its physical boundaries, or that the sealing had somehow intensified rather than contained its influence. Local residents reported a marked increase in strange phenomena, including the sounds of subterranean movement beneath their homes, as if vast spaces existed below the solid bedrock where none should be. The voices of the Blackwood brothers became a regular feature of local folklore, with multiple witnesses claiming to hear them calling out during certain atmospheric conditions, always speaking of their continuing journey through the passages that branch beneath all mountains and inviting others to join their eternal exploration. The iron gates installed at the cave entrance were found twisted and forced open on 3 separate occasions, always from the inside, despite no evidence of anyone entering the cave, with the metal bearing stress patterns that engineers couldn't explain without accepting that tremendous force had been applied from within. Cherokee elders, who had initially supported the sealing, began to express concerns that the action had disrupted some ancient balance, trapping energies or entities that were meant to move freely between worlds and potentially causing them to seek other outlets. Their fears seemed justified when other caves in the region began exhibiting similar anomalies, with experienced cavers reporting passages that hadn't existed before, acoustic phenomena matching those documented at Whispering Cave, and, most disturbing, encounters with figures they described as walking deeper than the earth allows. A researcher from the University of Tennessee who attempted to study these expanding phenomena disappeared entirely while exploring a previously mapped cave that had shown no unusual properties, with only his equipment found arranged in the same deliberate patterns that marked the Blackwood brothers' abandoned materials. The Cherokee interpretation that sealing the cave had merely displaced, rather than contained its influence, gained credence as reports spread of hikers experiencing missing time in areas miles from the original site, emerging with no memory of hours or sometimes days spent underground in caves they couldn't locate again. The hurricane of 1,889 brought unprecedented destruction to the region, but its most disturbing consequence was the partial reopening of Whispering Cave when massive flooding and mudslides tore away portions of the hillside containing the sealed entrance. Emergency crews arriving to assess the damage found that the iron gates had been twisted into impossible shapes by forces that clearly hadn't originated from the storm, with the metal formed into spirals and patterns that resembled the diagrams from the Blackwood journal. More troubling still were the items discovered scattered around the reopened entrance, objects that by all logic shouldn't have existed, including pages from the brothers' notebooks written on paper that showed no signs of age, despite being dated 22 years after their disappearance, clothing in the style of the 1,860 seconds that remained fresh and undeteriorated, and survey equipment bearing the Smithsonian expedition's markings but of a design that wouldn't be manufactured until years later. The cave itself had changed, with the entrance now leading to passages that didn't match any of the documented surveys, including a smooth-walled tunnel that descended at angles impossible for natural formation. Chalk markings on the walls created a map of extraordinary complexity, showing the cave system as a vast, three-dimensional maze, extending not just through the mountain but seemingly beyond physical space, with notations in the Blackwood brothers' handwriting describing routes to the cities of sound and the archives between. A hastily assembled team of investigators who entered the reopened cave reported that the acoustic phenomena had intensified dramatically, with the entire cave system resonating with frequencies that induced immediate disorientation and, in 2 cases, complete catatonia that lasted for days after removal from the cave. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be recent campsites at depths that should have been inaccessible, containing provisions and equipment from various eras, arranged as if their owners had simply stepped away moments before. The decision was made to reseal the cave with reinforced concrete and steel barriers, but workers reported that the new passages seemed to extend each night, as if the cave was growing like a living organism, reaching out through the mountain toward destinations unknown. Throughout the 20th century, as technology advanced and scientific understanding of geological phenomena expanded, Whispering Cave continued to attract researchers determined to explain its anomalies through conventional means, though each expedition seemed to add new mysteries rather than resolving existing ones. The 1923 expedition from Columbia University arrived with the latest electrical equipment, including powerful searchlights and early radio devices, intending to finally map the full extent of the cave system. But their efforts were thwarted when all electrical equipment simultaneously failed at precisely 1,847 feet below the entrance, a depth that corresponded exactly to calculations in the Blackwood journal regarding the threshold of translation. Team members reported that beyond this depth, even battery-powered devices ceased to function, while mechanical equipment like compasses and watches began displaying impossible readings, with time appearing to flow at different rates for different team members. The 1951 expedition from the University of Chicago brought photographers intending to document the cave formations, but their developed images revealed disturbing anomalies, including shadowy figures present in photographs where no one had stood during shooting, passages that appeared different in photos than they had to the naked eye, and in several cases, images of team members in locations they had never visited. Most unsettling were photographs taken in the cathedral that showed the Blackwood brothers' mirror array, still intact and functional, reflecting images of the photographers from angles that placed them simultaneously in multiple locations. The 967 Centennial Expedition, marking 100 years since the brothers' disappearance, utilized the most advanced equipment available, including electromagnetic sensors and early computer analysis of acoustic patterns. Their findings documented electromagnetic anomalies consistent with no known geological phenomenon, including localized fields that seemed to bend space itself, creating areas where objects could exist in multiple positions simultaneously. The acoustic analysis revealed that the cave's sound properties followed mathematical patterns identical to those in theoretical physics papers published decades after the Blackwood brothers' disappearance, suggesting they had discovered or been exposed to knowledge that wouldn't be formally developed by science for generations. Each expedition contributed pieces to an increasingly complex puzzle, while the cave itself seemed to evolve, in response to investigation, as if it were not merely a passive geological formation, but something far more dynamic and potentially conscious. Today, Whispering Cave remains officially closed to the public, sealed behind multiple barriers and warning signs after a final incident in 1974 that authorities have never fully explained to the public. Though Freedom of Information Act requests have revealed portions of heavily redacted government documents suggesting an event of unprecedented scope requiring federal intervention. The surrounding forest has been designated as restricted government land, with regular patrols and electronic surveillance, though local residents continue to report anomalous activities that suggest whatever dwells within the cave remains active despite all attempts at containment. Hikers in the area regularly report hearing their names called from the direction of the cave, always in familiar voices that draw them toward the restricted zone before they realize the impossibility of what they're hearing. The forest itself has developed unusual properties, with trees growing in spiral patterns that mirror the acoustic wavelengths documented in the cave, cold spots that appear and disappear without meteorological explanation, and areas where electronic devices malfunction in ways identical to the failures experienced by the 1923 expedition. Most persistent are the sightings of two well-dressed men in 19th-century attire, always glimpsed at the edge of vision, walking purposefully through the woods toward the cave entrance, visible only briefly before vanishing like mirages, but leaving physical traces including footprints in impossible locations and the lingering scent of lamp oil and limestone dust. Local police files contain dozens of reports from credible witnesses who have encountered these figures, always describing them as moving with purpose toward the sealed cave, sometimes accompanied by the sound of period-appropriate equipment clinking softly in rhythm with their stride. Wildlife biologists studying the area have documented behavioral anomalies in local fauna, including mass migrations away from the cave during certain lunar phases that correspond with the Blackwood brothers' calculations, birds that refuse to fly over specific coordinates, and the complete absence of burrowing animals within a mile radius of the site. Seismographic equipment installed to monitor potential cave-ins has recorded rhythmic vibrations from deep underground that follow no known geological patterns, but match exactly the frequencies documented in Dr. Turner's acoustic recordings from 1869. Former military personnel involved in the 1974 incident have occasionally broken their silence in anonymous interviews, describing encounters with spatial anomalies that extended far beyond the cave itself, including a full squad of soldiers who entered a fold in space near the cave entrance and emerged 3 days later with no memory of the elapsed time, but carrying equipment modifications that incorporated principles decades ahead of current technology. Satellite imagery of the area shows thermal anomalies that suggest vast hollow spaces beneath the mountain, where none should exist according to geological surveys, spaces that appear to shift and reconfigure between imaging sessions. The Department of Energy maintains a small research station nearby, officially designated as monitoring background radiation levels but staffed by personnel with expertise in theoretical physics and dimensional mathematics rather than nuclear science. Despite all official efforts to contain and study the phenomenon, local residents know the truth that the Blackwood brothers never truly vanished but found exactly what they sought: a doorway to spaces between the known world where they continue their eternal descent, occasionally visible to those who know where to look, always walking deeper into mysteries that human comprehension was never meant to grasp. all their journey through the breathing darkness as endless as the cave itself, which exists not merely beneath one mountain, but beneath all mountains, connecting to passages that branch through dimensions rather than stone, where they walk forever in the company of those who dwell between the spaces, having traded their humanity for knowledge of the infinite maze that underlies reality itself.